Dark Force Rising, the second book in Timothy Zahn's Thrawn Trilogy, was released in June of 1992. It didn't quite reach the heights that Heir to the Empire did, and made it to number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list for the week of June 21st, 1992, and ultimately was on the New York Times bestseller list for 15 weeks, so about 4 weeks shy of Heir to the Empire's record. Bantam was much more confident in how well Dark Force Rising would sell because unlike Heir to the Empire, which had a list price of $15, my original hardcover of Dark Force Rising shows the list price has been raised to $18.50. So, first, my recollections of the, frankly, many rereads I have done of this book. Once again, I remembered key parts, but sort of not where they fit into the narrative as a whole. I had very strong memories of Mara and Luke rescuing Talon Karrde from the Chimera, but like with my memories of Heir to the Empire, I had forgotten how very close to the end that happens. I was also surprised in my reread to find that the trio, even more so than in Heir to the Empire, are very scattered. Perhaps because Zahn wanted to pay homage to Empire Strikes Back, which is obviously the second movie, the middle movie of the original trilogy. And in that one, the trio is also pretty scattered for most of the movie. And like Empire Strikes Back, this book ends on a high point for the Empire and a comparatively lower point for our heroes. Nothing can really match up to Han Solo being taken away in carbonite by Boba Fett and Luke finding out the truth about his father, but the revelation we get in the end of this is, in a way, a game changer for the rest of the series. Even I, who knew that Thrawn needed ships because he had the cloning cylinders, was still surprised when I got to the end and found out, along with Luke and the rest of them, that they were already up and running, and now that he has most of the Katana Fleet, is well on his way to, I guess, galactic dominance. So, a brief summary. After the sort of standstill victory for neither side battle at the end of Heir to the Empire, Talon Karrde has chosen to pull his forces out of the planet Merkur. Princess Leia and Chewbacca head off on a mission to the Nogri's homeworld to try to see if there was some way that they could bring them over to the side of the New Republic. Han and Lando and Luke, for a bit, are trying to discover just what Borsk Faelia is up to after Admiral Akbar has been arrested because of a suspicious banking incident. And Luke, after, I guess, hanging out with Han and Lando for a bit, heads off to the planet Jomark to receive instruction from the Jedi Master C'baoth. Perhaps it's only logical, since this is the middle book, the second book in a 3-book series. I felt like there were instances where Dark Force Rising really showed that middle book dilemma. On the one hand, you have all this setup that is there, ready-made from the first book, but then you have to create additional setup for the third book and for the conclusion. So it did feel in a way as though our heroes are endlessly jotting off from place to place to place to place, which works a lot better in a book than it would in a film. In the Star Wars films, I've always felt that when they could reduce the number of planets visited, I felt like the plot was more coherent. But fortunately in a book, we don't have to actually show those planets. They're all in our imagination, so they can really visit as many as you like. However, I have found that you do start to, if not forget where they are, start to lose track of where they are. And I did have that issue a little bit in this book with characters, mostly Han and Lando, jetting from place to place to place. I talked in the last video about how I liked Luke's arc in Heir to the Empire, and I really liked how it continued in Dark Force Rising. He's a Jedi, he's the last of the Jedi, and he very much wants to regrow and refound the Jedi Order. So even though it may be a little naive of him to stay with C'baoth so long, I can understand why. Because on the one hand, he wants instruction, and it's very obvious from the beginning that C'baoth is not really going to give him the instruction he needs. But think of what we know of Luke's character. This is someone who risked his own life to save his father, who really hadn't shown any signs of any goodness within him. Luke knew there was goodness and was willing to stake everything on that. So with C'baoth, I find it very fitting to Luke's character that even though he almost immediately recognizes his madness and his mania, that he wants to do something about it. He wants to save him like he saved his father. And ultimately, at least at this point, he's not able to. He leaves with Mara to help her rescue Talon Karrde, and that subplot is completely unresolved. Obviously, Zahn is going to address it in the next book, but I just really like the little bit we saw there, that Luke's innate sense of goodness means that even when he comes across someone who is clearly mad, he doesn't immediately give up on them and thinks that, you know, even though he has no force ability for healing, that he can help somehow. In the same way, I like the further development we've gotten with Mara Jade's character. We found out in the previous book that she was the Emperor's hand. She was his personal assassin and messenger, and that with the loss of the Emperor and the fall of the Empire, she really lost her sense of self. Zahn gives us even more in this book with the revelation of the Emperor's last command, that for the past 5 years she has dreamed over and over and over again that the Emperor was unfairly, cruelly, incorrectly killed by Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, and that with his dying breath the Emperor orders her to kill Luke Skywalker. But she has a conundrum. Why kill someone when he's useful? And at least in this book, she's struggling with the Emperor's command when at the same time she both helped him in the past and needs his help now. Like in past books, she's not a particularly likable character. She's not nice. She's not kind. She's prickly. And I really enjoyed years ago and even now reading about a prickly character who's still allowed to be a woman. In the same way, I really appreciate that Zahn has taken Leia, who is pregnant, who understandably could be completely sidelined at this point in the story, but instead lets her do what she does best, being a diplomat, trying to reach out to people, get them to talk and listen, and in the same way that she's able to solve a mystery that has existed for nearly 50 years. I guess that's another point I wanted to bring up. This book, even more so than Heir to the Empire, made it really clear that at this point in the development of the Star Wars universe, George Lucas didn't have any idea where he was going to go with the prequels. The timeline we're given is that the horrific incident that happened on the Nogri's homeworld happened during the Clone Wars, and that was 44 years ago. At this point in the story, 5 years after Return of the Jedi, Luke and Leia are 28. So clearly there had to have been some sort of gap between the Clone Wars and the formation of the Empire and Luke and Leia's birth. There was another interesting thing I noted, that in chapter 24, Leia has memories of her mother. From the little we got in Return of the Jedi, people assume that Leia lived with her mother at some point before being given to the Organas to raise, and I think Zahn is working off of that same assumption there. Leia remembers her mother, remembers having to hide, and then remembers her mother's death and being taken in by the Organas. So it's sort of interesting to, while you're reading these books, chart out at the time what the prequels could have been. I didn't really get to talk about Talon Karrde in the previous video, so I thought I'd talk about him briefly. I like Karrde. I think what I most like about him is just his unabashed love of dad jokes. Most of his ships have very punny names. Wild Karrde, Last Resort. These are very much dad jokes, and at the same time, I very much appreciate that there is a otherwise intelligent, suave character in the Star Wars universe who unabashedly loves dad jokes. So you do you, Talon Karrde. You do you. And we're introduced to a few new characters as well. We have Senator Bella Bliss, who was one of the founders of the rebellion before he fell out with Mon Mothma, and is, in a way, the way that the Katana Fleet plotline is first brought up. He wants to return to the New Republic, but he can't bring himself to ask. I also appreciated that two of his, not minions, but associates that we were introduced to were both women, because once again, I kept running count of how many women we encounter in these books, and it's just not a lot. In a way, I would almost expect that if Zahn was making a statement about the anti-women bias in the Imperial Navy, that we would see loads and loads of women in the New Republic Navy, but it's not really the case. We have Wedge, obviously, and some other named officers who are all male. And then occasionally we're given, Rogue 7, but we're not given their gender. So, in a way, I like that Bella Bliss has some, more named ladies in the series. At first, when the Katana Fleet was introduced, I wondered a bit where we were going with this. I mean, obviously, legends of ghost ships exist in our world, and I wondered if this was going to be sort of like the Star Wars equivalent. And in a way, it was, if ghost ships were real and we found a buttload of them. I know people have expressed dislike that there are no super weapons or Death Star lights or anything like this in the Thrawn Trilogy, but I actually appreciate it. My favorite Star Wars movie is The Empire Strikes Back, and there's absolutely no super weapons of any kind in there. I find that Star Wars books and Star Wars media in particular sometimes use super weapons as like a default plot line. Like, you can't think of anything more interesting, so, they've got another Death Star, they've got a Sun Crusher, they've got a Dark Saber. So I appreciate that in this book, the thing that everyone is trying to get is not a super weapon, it's a bunch of ships. And in Thrawn's case, in the previous book, he discovered a way to really beef up the Imperial Navy. But with the sort of downside that when you have a lot of crewmen, then you need ships for them to crew. So the Katana Fleet, in a way, is a way for him to solve that. If you're cloning people left and right, 200 ships that have been floating in the middle of nowhere for years are a great thing to take advantage of. And can I just say, poor Lando. Lando in the first book has a functioning, burgeoning business, which is sort of not permanently ruined, but temporarily ruined by the Empire. And then it seems that ever since that happened, he's just chauffeuring Han around the galaxy. I mean, I'm sure they enjoy hanging out together, but in a way, I feel like, poor Lando. Does he have to be the chauffeur? maybe he could go off on an adventure of his own. Although, in retrospect, thinking back to like the Black Fleet crisis, maybe we don't want Lando to go off on an adventure of his own. And then Thrawn. I feel like I talked a bit about the disconnect between new Thrawn and old Thrawn in the previous video, but this book even more made me realize how different old Thrawn was and is than new Thrawn. He's still a villain. You're not supposed to root for him, but at the same time, he's so much smarter than everyone else around him, and he figures things out in such an interesting way that you almost can't help but root for him. You end up with this very conflicted feeling, like, this is the villain. He's villain-coded. I'm supposed to treat him as a villain. But on the other hand, you're like, he's so smart. Like, if only he weren't a villain. And then another thing I noticed with the visit to the Noghri homeworld was that their names all follow a certain pattern where it's some letters, an apostrophe, and then more letters. But Thrawn's personal assassin, Rook, his name doesn't follow that format at all. So then I'm left wondering, was he expelled from the Noghri people, but we don't get any sense of that in the book, so is this some code name he's taken? Basically, I have a lot of questions about Rook that I know are never going to be answered, so thanks, Thrawn. On the Princess Leia outfit count, I once again can say that Zahn has no interest in talking about what she's wearing. At one point, we get a description of Leia when she's getting dressed for a day after having slept in a Noghri bakehouse, and she mentions that she has to put her belt on very carefully because she's pregnant and it's uncomfortable, but honestly, that's the only description we get. I want more descriptions of Leia's hair and outfits. I need more descriptions of Leia's hair and outfits. So, in short, I found Dark Force Rising a very enjoyable read, a very easy read. In a way, I missed that our heroes were so separated for a lot of the story, but since I imagine that was a callback to The Empire Strikes Back, I can live with it. Like Heir to the Empire, I felt like it ended almost a little abruptly. The battle for what remained of the Katana Fleet took up such a relatively short part of the book, I was expecting it to be longer. But all in all, I was excited to read this one, and I'm very excited to continue on to what happens in The Last Command.